Welcome everyone to Office Hours with the Journal of Genocide Research. This is our first interview with one of our authors, and we're very excited to start this new series for our YouTube channel. My name's Dirk Moses. I'm the senior editor of the Journal of Genocide Research. On the call here, we have one of the other editors, Professor Melly Tanelian, who's at the University of Michigan, and our editorial assistant, Tisha von Bibra, who's in London and at the LSE, and running the show behind the scenes, Sheet Mehta, based in California. Our first guest today is Professor Manuel Schwab. He's a professor of anthropology at the American University of Cairo and has a forthcoming book called Messianic Empire. He tweets on humanitarian economics in Sudan from the perspective of political psychology, value investments, and violence. And he wrote an article in our Gaza forum called Gaza, Germany, and the Post-Perpetrator Unconscious, Ozymandias and the Hague, that came out on the 12th of August last month. And with that, I hand over the first question to begin the discussion to Melanie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here. I would love to begin asking you, Dr. Schwab, about the main intervention of your piece in the journal, and in particular, for those of our audience who has not read your piece yet, it would be helpful if you would engage some of your sort of key concepts that underlie really your argument. And here I'm thinking about the concept of post-perpetrator political unconsciousness, which is so central to your argument about Germany's political behavior. And if you could explain what that unconsciousness is and how does it make Germany different from other nations? Specifically, how does a country organize, as you write, its entire national being around the idea that it can banish collective aggression from its national ambit?
Great, thanks so much, all of you, for having me, and thanks for the lovely question. Post-perpetrator political unconscious works within this article on kind of two levels. The one is that, as you rightly point out, Melanie, it's a description of a peculiar relationship within the German national imaginary to the fact of past perpetrations, and a construction of a whole idea of norms and ideals of how the future should look based on reacting to, trying to sequester, trying to overcome that past. But on a second level, I think that it actually is an emerging form for an increasing number of states that, by my lights, are reorganizing some of the finer points of how global imperial practices happen under the aegis of an older idea of global coloniality. And so around this notion that one can be both cognizant of one's past perpetration and a moral authority at once. And that this recuperation has really escaped many of the states with passive perpetration, whether liberal, whether conservative, whatever the political ilk. It's really escaped them in a certain way, and I think it's being put together here. There's much more to say, but I think that that's a good beginning.
So if you were to summarize the main contribution that your article is making to the larger discussions that we've been presenting in the journal, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, there's in a certain sense, the article really is firmly rooted with both feet in the discussions that I was following with great interest, happening in several places. But really, the journal has been one of the few consistent and safe places where we can have these discussions in a heated way, and also with a certain kind of rigor in the historical analysis. But one of the things that struck me in the discussions is that with all of the, with the paradigmatic role that the Holocaust still holds, with genocide research, within imaginaries of genocide, and within a larger kind of political temporality that we, within our era, that there is, for good reason, a lot of bewilderment about why Germany, in the words of my students, in the words of my interlocutors, is yet again on the wrong side of history. And that question is remarkable and necessary, and I think was answered too quickly with the most obvious level at which we can answer, which is guilt. And I really wasn't convinced that that exhausted the kinds of motivations we had. After all, my sense is that guilt would have actually led much more easily a path toward intransigence in the face of another genocide, regardless of national character. Yeah. It would have led, in other words, to something of the opposite of the German position. And thinking more and more about what else was motivated there, I was reminded of some of the undercurrents, really, over the history of Germany's recovery and reconstitution of itself in various phases, something Dirk has written about extensively. Different phases where you saw over and over again that guilt kicking easily into a form of pride, kicking easily into a proprietary relationship to the kinds of currency that history has in our present, and kicking very easily into a paternalistic explanation to everybody else about what the lessons of history really are. Yeah. And I wanted to trace that in a rooted way. I mean, also because I, for better or for worse, was incapable constitutionally of sitting and writing a piece that did not address Gaza in the current. And that's how this came together. So really the central argument is, if we get away from guilt and we start to see other deeper undercurrents, other kinds of what I call political desires in here, which different readers respond to that notion differently. But if we read for different motivations, we get a much richer notion of what's actually motivating this, well, what I can only call a German aberration in its kind of historical reckoning.
And so, just for our audience who perhaps has not read your piece, when you talk about these political desires, what are you talking about within your article?
I mean, I think the most central one in the article is also the most painful one to just name for what it is. I don't think Germany is unique as a nation that has a particular role assigned to violence. I think in a certain way, the modern state has always kept a really particular function, instrumentality, but also symbolic force that can be unleashed and retooled through sudden violence. And one of the remarkable things about at least stretches of German history is that violence had to be channeled through other pathways. It was taboo. After the Nazis were greeted initially as the liberators of Germany, and all the history that we know that unfolded from there, a repudiation of that perpetrator past for long stretches also meant a really uneasy relationship to that violence. But we know this from other desires. Pushing them away does not make them lose their force. Quite the contrary often. And I think in the case of this attachment to southern violence that we see in Germany, this moment in Gaza has been so heated and enervated, not simply because, well, it's an ongoing genocide, and I don't know many people in the world that are not enervated in one way or the other by it, but also because it presented a really unique opportunity given the identitarian constellations Germany was confronting to finally have violence and get it right. So the first desire, I hate to say it, is a desire for that southern violence as a recuperated faculty. There are also the desires to be finally truly post-perpetrator, to finally say we're over it, to finally say, but as far as I can tell, things are going quite the opposite direction.
Great. I would like to stay with violence for a minute, and connecting it to Gaza and the way that you're explaining it also in your piece. So if Germany sort of views support for Israel's campaign in Gaza as a violent event where, as you write, Germany can get it right, how does then the diplomatic act of refusing to recognize Palestinian statehood really serve this purpose? So by denying Palestine the status and the right to this political violence or any kind of form of legitimate violence that comes with sovereignty, does Germany achieve a clear sort of moral division? And how does this refusal help Germany confirm its own sort of restored moral authority by actively condemning or better foreclosing access to a legitimate Staatsgewalt, as you call it, while affirming, on the other hand, Israel's access as the ultimate example of a morally justified self-defense? So how is this helping Germany, or how is it playing into the debate? What utility does it have?
It's an excellent question. I'm going to do my best because I think it does have a lot of facets. I mean, I guess the important thing to state at the outset is that anti-Palestinian animus is overdetermined, multidimensional, and does not necessarily come from within a German position alone, as we very well know. If you open your newspaper or are checking in with current events. And I think some of that classic old anti-Palestinian animus is just operating. That script continues. I think the refusal to recognize a Palestinian state is both backward and forward-looking. It's backward-looking in the sense that in this immediate, we know the temporality that we tend to be given. October 7th was day zero. And any sense of an actual history and political life to Palestinian existence cannot abide that narrative. But if you are possessed of that, which I think many of our politicians, at least in Germany, commit to it, then to recognize Palestinian statehood would be, and here they're just parroting a line that we hear from the Israeli right wing, to reward terrorism. But the backward-looking perspective goes much further. It goes much further back toward the role that Palestine and the occupation played in the imagination of the New Left in the late 60s and 70s, yeah? And then it goes back to a moment where Germany was really quite lucky that it was other people who had to deal with the survivors of their camps. Yeah. And I think any of those kind of historical moments begin to get shaken if we do have an actual recognition. I think it's also forward-looking. I think if you were to recognize Palestinian statehood, if you are driven by the beliefs that we see many German politicians driven by, you assume that you have handed the argument for a legitimate monopoly of violence to Palestinians. And that's a no-go. So, I mean, that's the best I can do on that. I hope that feel free to follow up.
Thank you.
So I have first one question about your reference, your literary reference. So in your piece, you invoke Percy Shelley's sonnet, Ozymandias. And I wanted to know, how do you think does Germany's support of Israel mirror this kind of hubris or reflect a supposed awareness of inevitable decline, as you argue in the piece?
I think in the longue durée, inevitable decline is right, but that may simply apply to, any political formation or state in the long run. But Ozymandias, in this case, I have always found interesting in the sonnet the tension between the warning that it's usually read as to empires. Look on my works and despair, because my works are now nothing but ruins. And on the other side, a certain authority that speaks from beyond the grave. And it, for me, was an interesting way to stage the difficulty with haunting as a master trope of how we think about the memory of unacceptable pasts. Because while we assume that haunting makes us ethical, while we assume that this haunting is a way to be constantly cognizant of the mistakes of the past, in fact, often the way we've been seeing it in the last decades, increasingly it tilts toward the living haunting the dead. And what I mean by that is the living really appropriating the memory of these pasts as a moral authority that, by my lights, and we are still living in an age where we have some survivors who are subscribing to this too, of the Holocaust, by my lights, they contravene exactly what that memory, old-fashioned, ought to be doing, yeah? And so the Ozymandias kind of calling from the grave as a warning, but on the other hand, you have a present empire that goes back and says, see, this was our past. We have a very special authority to understand what the workings of empire. I found that tension really fruitful in the piece.
That's great. Thank you for that explanation. I was also wondering about your reference to Özbek's argument that Germany seeks to overcome this historical perpetrator status by sort of transmitting its own guilt to migrant communities. And one quote from your article is, these exercises of reforming racialized others concretize fantasies of overcoming, whose restorative effect is achieved by demonstrating that the post-perpetrator moral conscience can be effectively transmitted to communities with problematic cultural attachments. So how do you see this transactional logic applied in current debates about pro-Palestinian censorship, for example, in Germany?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where to begin? I mean, look, I read somewhere in the many, many wonderful articles that came out in the, in the German sphere and addressing this German wake. And I haven't found the exact figure again, but I read somewhere that a shocking number of the claims of plaintiffs claiming to be victims of anti-Semitic violence or speech at the demonstrations have in fact been uniformed and on-duty German police officers. And I don't know, maybe Dirk, you remember the exact figure, but it was a shockingly high number. Now, that could be an article in itself addressing the kinds of identity appropriations, the projection of oneself into the figure of a victim that actually one wasn't. And there's loads to be done with this. But I think at the simplest level, this is a way of saying this problem comes from elsewhere. Finally, it comes from elsewhere. Finally, it's not our ancestors. Finally, it's not us. Finally, it is not the unconscious, but perhaps still buried perpetrator motivations that we have constantly tried to scrub out of our national imaginary. Finally, it's these Muslims importing anti-Semitism. It's these. And this goes back, and I think Jurek's book is the best that I know on this and should be on everybody's list if they want to understand this attitude. This goes back to civic education with the first and second generation, first, the 70s and 80s waves of Turkish migration. But it is alive and well and working its way through the German political imaginary forward.
Okay. I might ask a quick question then about the German investment, the German elite political class investment in the relationship with the state of Israel. Now, it's one thing for the German state to care about the flourishing of Jewish life in Germany itself, which I think is normal, natural, predictable, and admirable and necessary in light of German history. But this bilateral relationship with Israel is another matter. It's related but distinct, and it's been theorized by people like Daniel Mabetsky in his book that there's sort of an atonement that the Israelis can give to the Germans, which is symbolic, and in return, the Germans give material benefits to the Israelis. So there's an exchange, and this has been going on since the 1950s, and it's just actually, intensified over the last decades. How do you see this relationship in terms of the sort of the theoretical apparatus that you set up?
Thanks, Derek. I mean, this is again one of those wonderful questions that where you can peel the layers of the onion back and back and back. Yeah. So, on the most obvious level, to conflate Jews and Israel, the state, makes a much easier memory theater, in the words of, Max Cholek and several people have written on this. It makes for a much easier choreography of certifiable ways to say we got it right, we're doing it better, we are overcoming.
Actually, there is a sort of a thought bubble related to this. I mean, when you read the German press, you've got to read the German newspapers every day to see the turns of phrase they use, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I do that. And they constantly use this language of folk, wir Deutschen und jüdische Volk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like I pinch myself. It's like, are we still in the first half of the 20th century, where the world is populated by sort of distinct völker, peoples, ethno-national, and that there are transactions between that people and this people. I mean, the German political class seems to imagine the Jews as a folk, which is spread throughout the world, and this, of course, mirrors a Zionist version of it, and that so when they're dealing with Jewish people in Germany, there's really no difference to those that are living in Israel. They just happen to live in a different place. Like citizenship has no bearing here. I mean, it's deeply illiberal and redolent of a political imaginary from the first half of the 20th century, which is the basis for genocidal thinking and thinking in terms of ethnic cleansings. I mean, so what I'm intrigued about is how the German attempt to overcome its Nazi past has actually made it get stuck in the categories which led to the problem in the first place.
There's the moment within a few weeks of October 7th when Netanyahu meets for the first time Scholz, and he says, well, yeah, Hamas are the new Nazis now. This is a fantasy fulfillment that no German chancellor could have dreamed of being handed. And yet probably a fantasy that no German chancellor has ever not had somewhere on the horizon of their consciousness. The real task over generations is to get to that place where the Nazis are somewhere else. And in a certain sense, racial geographies are a much more convenient map of the world if one wants to project out certain characteristics of the self than political economy, ways of seeing the world, then a critical take on nationalism itself, and to think about, the conditions of diasporicity, or take your pick. None of these things hand us a map of the world on which we can play out a complicated game of chess, where we exchange positions and roles in historical places and hope to land in a constellation that gets us out of that past. But there's also a much more sinister side, which is to forge a relationship to the Israeli state instead of to Jews immediately allows one to remove, as we see the German press and law doing all the time, to remove the inconvenient Jews who happen not to be Zionists and who happen not to buy into this particular and ethnicized notion of never again, and who happen to be vocal about it, and who happen to be vocal about it in Germany, and who I thought naively in the early stages of this crackdown would be more protected than any of the rest of us on the street. And that turned out to be incredibly naive on my part, because a special vitriol is reserved for these inconvenient Jews, and they cannot be attacked in the same way if we don't have such a profound illusion of Israel as the nation and the ethno-national project for Jews and Judaism, that we literally can begin to make moves to declare Jews not Jewish enough. And there's a long history of this in Germany, as everyone knows, but much less studied is the history of how this comes precisely from inside the memory culture, precisely from inside a more or less progressive, liberal, with all the scare quotes intended, version of the German historical consciousness. So I think that that darker side is the one that we need to pay the most attention to, because it's the one where all kinds of reorganizations of political economy, of moral economies are taking place. I don't know if I'm still addressing you, Dirk, on that one.
Makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense.
This actually goes back to the idea of the denial of Palestinian statehood, because as long as the state is being denied, this kind of constellation, as you were explaining it, the sort of move towards in exterministic anti-Semitism can remain in that space. Once that is resolved, then that has to be reconsidered in a different way. Yeah, thank you, Manuel.
I mean, if I can just follow up a little bit on what you're saying, because I think it's really important. You know, this inquiry reminds me of the formulation from Robert Meister's After Evil, that one of the responses of a kind of liberal script after evil, that also is, of course, capacious enough to embrace Zionism as a liberal formation of this formula. He says the idea is simple. Victimhood wants nationhood. Victimhood gives nationhood. Victimhood deserves nationhood. What would that imply if the German state were to recognize a Palestinian state? Would that imply a recognition of the victimhood of what? Of this last genocide? Of the siege of Gaza since 2007? Of the 67 of the entire occupation? Back to the Nakba? Well, probably all of them in some ways would come up for reckoning in that case, because a state allows you to do that, and a state is given the entitlements to pursue those kinds of things. I think the more threatening part of the Palestinian state, beyond anti-Palestinian animus, which is there and should not be discounted, beyond the racial geographies, a more threatening part from within the German and this post-perpetrator unconscious that I'm describing is that it could upend the entire historiographic ground on which this identity is built. And it does so not only within Germany, but for a much larger North Atlantic imperial formation, which is why I say toward the end of the article, as much as I have focused on this post-perpetrator unconscious, as something we see distilled in Germany in a remarkable way. I don't think it's limited there. I think we are seeing other settler colonial states, the United States, other settler colonial projects and other kind of liberal imperial projects very quickly rushing to help fine-tune this political formation, because it's a really, really powerful one.
No, I agree with that too. The German absolution transaction requires that the Germans are the perpetrators and Jewish people, the Jewish folk, as the Germans put it, are the victims. But if Jewish people, some in the perpetrator role because of the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and in 1948 as well, then they can't perform that absolution role for the Germans, and then this post-Holocaust identity falls apart is exactly what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, there's a doubling down against coloniality, so-called post-colonial studies. For example, the new culture minister, Weimar, has reiterated in a new concept that there'll be no discussion of colonial crimes and colonialism in his new vision of German, the German cultural institutions. So it's really a backward step from the red-green government, which made some attempts, but in the teeth of great resistance. So there's actually a retrenchment in Germany at the moment in order to solidify and consolidate that identity formation. And that means, of course, as you say, that non-conformist Jewish people will be victims as much as anyone else. And the Berlin police, there's no limits to the violence that they unleash on protesters. And they regard themselves as the victims of the protesters. And as you say, even victims of anti-Semitic incidents or attacks, because protesters, are uttering certain chants, for example. They decide are anti-Semitic, although the courts have said they're not. So we're really in a bit of in a house of historical mirrors, a madhouse in Germany at the moment. It's the people peer in to see how it's going, and it's not going very well. You're someone who grew up in Germany, but it's based in Cairo. I mean, you can look inside, and you're an anthropologist, so you can look inside their cultural system to see how it works. But I think it's very difficult for people inside it to get that outsider perspective to see how their subjectivities are in fact a product of that environment. And so they don't have the epistemological purchase. So when you do say the obvious things, like a number of us, myself, you and others have sort of made these points, you're met with incredulity. Like, how could you say that? Or that can't make sense. Yeah.
An incredulity that literally comes in the form of, if you talk about Israeli atrocity, I can't take you seriously in academic conferences. Not to mention, if you dare to utter the name genocide for these last 2 years. But an incredulity that is also, I mean, I say that in the article, and it's by no means to let, people who are also old friends off the hook for these positions, because I don't believe we can afford to. But they are deeply felt commitments. The incredulity is a genuine experience, not a rhetorical gesture. I sometimes had the sense when I was having these discussions in New York that I run across much more strategic and feigned incredulity in the debates there than I do in Germany, where there's also the strategic, but it's amazing. And in some senses, I have to say, to me, quite a bit scarier to see how bound to the very fabric of identification it is. It's truly felt. And there is something that we will all need to reckon with, whether as scholars of these works of memory and are starting to. And I think, some of the debates in the journal have really been pushing this ahead. Not only scholars on memory and on political violence, also probably just as, residents of Germany, people who have to share a world with these constellations, because on the one hand, there's all of these political desires involved. But as you alluded to a couple of minutes ago, Dick, these political desires are matched in a transactional way with weapons deliveries, with the moral support before the ICJ and the ICC and the European Court of Justice and numerous other places for a continuation of atrocity-based counterinsurgency of this genocidal dimension, as usual. And therefore, they're not simply things that we can, because they are genuinely felt, tolerate. Because they fuel, this is a place where our deepest political subjectivities, if they are drafted into this notion, are channeled directly into a support for an unimaginable litany of atrocities that don't appear at the moment when we're talking to be slowing down.
So I was wondering, what do you think of the most recent developments in Germany on this question? In August, for example, the German government announced that it would stop authorizing weapons exports to Israel for arms that may be used in Gaza, which I think it's important to say doesn't mean that the actual export of weapons has stopped. But I'm curious as to what you think that development means within the framework that you've set up here.
I try very hard to be as generous as I can, and I wish I could be generous in this case. But I think we all remember, as students of this history, that the moment of the announcement of suspended weapons contracts came virtually in the same breath as the announcement that there were all kinds of things that were exempted that would simply continue to be delivered. The material support, from what I can tell, has not been slowed nearly enough. The moral and rhetorical support for this genocide seems to me to be holding steady or increasing. The sedimentation of this authorizing logic to produce a script from which, as Dirk was saying, everything tagged post-colonial, basically non-white public spaces, I'm sorry to put no too fine a point on it, but non-white public spaces are subjected to a matrix of suspicion, a forensics of suspicion, an attention to the minutiae of people's behaviors that, well, if I were a liberal state with the kinds of anxieties that we see the German state displaying, I wouldn't let go of this terribly fast. So I'm not a big optimist at the moment. It, for me, is very parallel to recognition by not Germany, but by some of the other European states of Palestinian statehood. Of course, it's crucial. Of course, many of us have been waiting for a recognition like that. But I'm with everybody who says this is a moment where we can barely celebrate this, where in a certain sense we need to actually be afraid of what it means to recognize statehood on the rubble of Gaza, where we need to worry what it means to be willing to take that symbolic position when the questions of sovereignty, when the questions of the actual political existence of Palestinians, these have been systematically undermined, destroyed, and held at bay by the same people who are saying that it's necessary to recognize. And I have a similar feeling. A friend of mine, when the article came out, said, "Oh, it's good that this is coming out because the tree is just starting to fall over." Friend from South Africa, and I said, feels a little bit, well, I said it feels a little bit like blowing on an old oak. I'm not seeing any move. But I quite like the response. Her response was, "You all just got to keep on blowing." And that's about as optimistic of a note that I can leave us on. But I mean, I can't say I think we've gotten further.
Yeah, I mean, the final observation is that this is very much an identity formation within the German political class, and over 80% of the German public are against it. So you have this,
Exactly.
and are convinced that genocide is taking place. So you have this radical disjuncture between the political class and the rest of the population. And, maybe that's something that could be the subject of another discussion. We don't have time for that now. We've hit 40 minutes for our discussion, which is about our limit. Manuel, we're delighted that you were prepared to come speak to us as the first installation of our Journal Genocide Research Office Hours. Thank you, Melody.
Thanks to all of you for the questions.
Okay.
And having inside.
Achit for doing the management of the call, and the editing of this will appear on YouTube before too long. And more will be coming because we're publishing a lot on all kinds of issues, including this one. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you all.